Good evening, everybody. My name is Nick Foster. I'm the director of the Wilton Historical Society, and I'm your lecturer for the evening. Thank you so much for coming out to listen to me talk about baseball for as long as you will physically let me. As a huge baseball fan, I'm always excited to talk about baseball, and the Wilton Farmers are such a cool story. I think most people don't know much about the Farmers, but they were sort of your quintessential semi-pro baseball team in the early 20th century. And they were arguably the most dominant team in Fairfield County for basically the first 40 years of the 20th century. They were just unbelievably good, and a really unique and interesting team. And I also find that baseball is just a fascinating topic to talk about when you're talking about history because of how much baseball intertwines with American history. So it's really cool to see sort of baseball and American history side by side. And to sort of kick off the tone of my lecture, I'm going to start with a clip of a movie you may or may not recognize. Some mild spoilers ahead if you haven't seen a 35-year-old movie, but let me start with this.
Ray, people will come, Ray. They'll come to Iowa for reasons they can't even fathom. They'll turn up your driveway, not knowing for sure why they're doing it. They'll arrive at your door as innocent as children, longing for the past. Of course, we won't mind if you look around, you'll say. It's only $20 per person. They'll pass over the money without even thinking about it. For it is money they have and peace they like.
Ray. Just sign the papers.
And they'll walk out to the bleachers. Sit in shirt sleeves on a perfect afternoon. They'll find they have reserved seats somewhere along one of the baselines where they sat when they were children and cheered their heroes. And they'll watch the game. And it'll be as if they'd dipped themselves in magic waters. The memories will be so thick, they'll have to brush them away from their faces.
Ray, when the bank opens in the morning, they'll foreclose.
People will come, Ray.
You're broke, Ray. You sell now or you lose everything.
The one constant through all the years, Ray, has been baseball. America has rolled by like an army of steamrollers. It's been erased like a blackboard, rebuilt and erased again. Baseball has marked the time. This field, this game, is a part of our past, Ray. It reminds us of all that once was good, and it could be again. Oh, people will come, Ray. People will most definitely come.
How can you not be romantic about baseball? Come on. Now, as a historian and a baseball fan, you talk about baseball being the constant through America's past. Well, I take that as a challenge, so I'm going to start examining whether or not that's the case. Whatever issues you have, people love Field of Dreams, people hate, I know some people hate Field of Dreams, but I like this idea of baseball being a constant throughout American history. And I think in many ways, it's not necessarily a constant, maybe more of a reflection of American history. And I'll give some examples now, but baseball, I think, in many ways has been sort of both pushed American history along and been pushed by American history in many ways. I mean, think about someone like Jackie Robinson. He breaks the color barrier in 1947 in the major leagues. And 7 years before schools are desegregated in the United States, so baseball is desegregated. This is 17 years before the Civil Rights Act, so baseball's sort of breaking ground here. Of course, if you know quite a bit about baseball history, you know that Jackie Robinson wasn't actually the first African American to break the color barrier. That was actually Moses Fleetwood Walker. Moses and his brother Weldy actually played in the American Association, a major league that was in the 1880s, went defunct. But he is actually considered the first. He played for the Toledo Blue Stockings as a catcher, and actually was probably the first African American. Actually, possibly the second, but it's the first. William White is unconfirmed. But Moses Fleetwood Walker was the first person we do know that broke the color barrier in the U.S. And if we look at U.S. history, it sort of matches what we'd expect. We see after Reconstruction, African Americans gets rights. get the right to vote, and in baseball, they get the right to play it in the major leagues, and then we see some of those rights and the ability to play in the major leagues get pushed to the side. But actually, Moses Walker actually has a Connecticut connection. He actually played for Waterbury in the Eastern League during later in the 1880s. So Connecticut connection there with baseball. We see baseball adapting to history around it during World War II. We see as players get drafted and sent overseas, we see baseball turning to sort of creating somewhat of equality. We see someone like Pete Gray, a one-armed outfielder for the St. Louis Browns, played half a season in 1945. So we see someone with a disability being able to play in the major leagues. We see women joining the All-American Girls Baseball League, another baseball movie, A League of Their Own. Maybe you've seen it. But we see women joining, playing not Major League Baseball, but playing at a high Major League level. And, mirroring women going to work in factories in previously men-dominated spaces because of World War II. They were really desperate for players during World War II. Actually, there was a 15-year-old by the name of Joe Nuxhall who played in the major leagues. Was a pitcher for about 2 games. Wasn't very good, but he went on to have a major league career after, once he sort of came of real baseball age. And then we see maybe some not so great things from American history coming over to major leagues, like fashion sense. Everyone wearing powder blue in the 1970s. The Cubs and Royals I can forgive for taking on powder blue in the 70s and 80s. The Cardinals, Twins, and Braves maybe not so much. But you can see throughout American history, baseball has been sort of this mirror reflection of America. And I think baseball is really unique in that sense. Which is why I love talking about it, both as a huge baseball fan and a historian of Wilton, but also sort of a baseball historian. So, which is why I love talking about the Farmers, because the Wilton Farmers were, again, this sort of really unique thing that baseball was in the early 1900s. They had these semi-pro teams all over the United States, because before television, before radio really takes off, if you wanted to watch baseball, you had to do it locally. You might take the train into New York City if you lived in somewhere like Wilton, but for the most part, if you want to watch a game, you had to do it somewhere like here, Orms Field in Wilton, Connecticut. And the Orms Field Wilton Farmers were the hottest ticket in town during the 1920s and 1930s. In a town that was about 1,300 people, the Farmers routinely drew about that amount to watch games. So you can imagine how popular they must have been. And the Farmers, as the years roll along through Wilton, they sort of matched, I think, the story of Wilton and how it's developing. Now, if we want to thank anybody for the Farmers, we have to thank this guy, Charles Oram. And if you guys have been to Oram's Diner, you can also thank Charles Oram, as he is the founder of Oram's Diner. Oram was born in Ohio, and was actually worked as a cash register mechanic back when that was a thing. And later moved to New Jersey as a young man in his 20s, opened up a candy store, and then finally, for some reason, came to Wilton. I haven't been able to figure out why. But in 1918, he purchased some land, and then 2 years later, he purchased 26 acres of farmland at 213 Danbury Road, where Sunrise Senior Living is today. And he started a dairy farm with 1 cow, and then later expanded. But he was a pretty smart businessman, and he really wanted to turn his dairy into something more than just another dairy farm. And Wilton was chock full of farms in this time period. Most of Wilton looked like this, a lot different than today. The population, as I mentioned, was about 1,300 people, which is actually down 400 people. In 1920, it was 1,300. In 1910, it was about 1,700. So the town's actually shrinking by the time Charlie Orams comes to town. But most of what the town is farmland like this. And it was dairy farms, goat farms, sheep farms, not what you'd expect from the suburbs here in Connecticut. But this is basically what the town had looked like for 250 years leading up to this point. And it's not until a bunch of New Yorkers start moving out to Wilton in the 1920s that it starts to become kind of what you'd expect today. History tends to repeat itself. A bunch of New Yorkers moving out after COVID, a bunch of New Yorkers in the 1920s moving out to Wilton because they don't like living in the hot city anymore. But with these New Yorkers, they wanted entertainment, and Charlie Oram wanted to give it to them. So he built Orams Field. And sort of like Field of Dreams, he went out into his dairy farm and plowed up a bunch of land and made a baseball field and named it after himself, because why not? But It's no coincidence that during the 1920s, as I mentioned, New Yorkers come out wanting entertainment, but it was also the first time that people sort of had money in their pockets and time to burn. So it was a perfect time for the entertainment industry, for things like baseball, things like boxing, a lot of sports, movies, radio shows. This is when entertainment's really taking off, because a lot of people now, they're no longer farming. They work sort of white-collar jobs, kind of what we know like in Wilton today. And they decide, hey, on the weekends, I got time to kill. Let's go to a baseball game. Why not? So Orem did this because he was going to capitalize on the entertainment industry, but he also wanted to get people to his ice cream stand. So before Orem's Diner was a diner, it was an ice cream stand. And as a dairy farm next door, it was pretty fresh ice cream, as you might imagine. So he builds Orem's Field and has the ice cream stand. You can see in the left of this photo, right over here, that is Orem's Diner in its original location. And Orem loved baseball, and he figured the best way to get people to the ice cream stand was baseball games. So he builds this pretty rudimentary field, admittedly. But right away, the farmers become incredibly popular. And the reason that they became incredibly popular was because the man he hired to manage the team was a guy by the name of Frank Squire Riley. And we'll talk about him in a bit, but Orem realized the way that you could make sure that your team was popular was your team had to be good. And Squire Riley was a semi-pro baseball player who had a bunch of connections to players all over New England and New York. And he was going to get the best team possible. But before we get to the team, we got to talk about the field, because Orem's Field was about as unique a place to watch a game as there was in anywhere in New England at the time, save maybe a few that we'll talk about in a second. But I love Orem's Field because it's in the tradition of baseball fields being weird. Baseball is the only sport where the playing surface is unique to every stadium. If you play basketball, hockey, football, it's all the same dimensions everywhere you go, but baseball's not. The stands are different shapes, foul territory is different shapes. Other than the baseball diamond, you can kind of play with whatever you want. And Orem certainly was that. So, you look at some of the traditions of other stadiums across the major leagues. You look at somewhere like Fenway Park. It had to adapt to the city block it was on, so you get this really short but high fence, the Green Monster. You look at some defunct fields like the Polo Grounds, which wasn't a baseball stadium to start. It was a place where they played polo. So it was very rectangular and these really short foul lines and then a huge deep center field, as deep as you could possibly get. Even into the early 21st century, you get weird baseball shapes. Some of you may remember Tal's Hill, where the Houston Astros play. They actually had a hill in center field. They did away with it, but some baseball fans may remember Jim Edmonds famously falling up Tal's Field and making an incredible catch. And the Farmers had their own unique landscape on the field. They had a hedge in right field that was in play. And when I say that it was in play, I mean it was quite literally running through the center of right field. Depending on who the batter was, the right fielder would step either in front of the hedge or behind it to start. So if you had a power-hitting lefty and you knew the ball was going to be hit deep, the right fielder would start behind the hedge. And if it was a shallow fly ball, you had to hop it to get to make a catch. Center field had a chicken coop in it, dead center field, so you had to dodge that if you were chasing a fly ball. And there was no fences, so if the ball was hit far enough into left field, it would roll into the Norwalk River, and it was a ground rule double. So the ground rules in here really came into play. Also, because this was a cow pasture, you had to dodge the cow droppings depending on where you were in the outfield. So really unique place to watch a game, to say the least. But as I mentioned, the Farmers were great to start, and it was because Frank Riley, this guy right here. He had been a renowned semi-pro player in his younger days. He lived in Norwalk, and he wanted to make sure that he had the absolute best team possible. So he started recruiting from players, not just in Wilton, but from all over. You can see this team here. The Farmers played in a couple different leagues throughout their existence. This team in 1926 were playing in the 1925 were playing in the Eastern Loop, or the Eastern League. That dissolved pretty quickly, and they kept sort of bouncing around. But it was basically all the same towns just forming in different leagues over the years. The games would start somewhat informally. It was basically just in 1920 when they started the Farmers. Before there were even a league, it was basically just Wilton. They weren't even the Farmers yet. They were the Wilton Athletic Club. And they basically just started challenging other semi-pro teams that they could find. And the semi-pro here was that the players didn't get paid a salary. They got paid a percentage of the tickets. So basically all these players signed on and agreed to one of the reasons Orams wanted good players is so he could get the gate tickets, but the good players also wanted to play on good teams so that it would be popular and they could sell more tickets and make more money that way. And this was a common way for players. If you weren't in the major leagues, you weren't on your destined to be a pro player, you join on these semi-pro teams and you'd basically sort of, what was called barnstorming. You'd sort of travel the local area and challenge anybody who'd be willing to play you. And you can see here, talking about the Farmers being quite good. This was an article from the Norwalk Evening Sentinel from 1922, and they're talking about how Wilton had lost a game to a Norwalk team and saying how unusual that was. It says, Wilton has never been known to lose 2 games straight, and it's a bad look doesn't daunt them in the least. Norwalk has as much chance of winning the next 2 games as a ball player would of convincing Hump Lindy that he was wrong. Now, I have no idea who Hump Lindy is. This is a strange, anachronistic, or old-timey saying. I have Googled, I have looked everywhere to figure out. If anyone knows who Hump Lindy is, please let me know. But clearly at the time, it meant this was a man who was couldn't be convinced that he was wrong. So the Farmers losing 2 games in a row apparently was an impossible thing that no one had ever seen before, because they basically just crushed everybody they played. And the reason that they crushed everybody they played is because they had some former major leaguers on the roster. Now, one of these guys, their probably most famous major leaguer was a guy by the name of Columbia George Smith. His nickname was Columbia because he went to Columbia University. He joined the Farmers in 1924. He was a pitcher. He played about 4 or 5 years in the major leagues. He was a pretty miserable major leaguer, all things considered. He lost 20 games in 1923, the year before. I think his record the year before he joined the Farmers and got cut from the New York Giants was like 3 wins and 20 losses. He was not particularly good. But he grew up in Greenwich, had gone to Columbia, and after his major league career was over, he was looking for a semi-pro team to play for, and Squire Riley came calling. Probably the most famous thing that Smith is known for, other than playing for the Wilton Farmers and losing 20 games, was that he gave up Babe Ruth's longest ever home run. And there's a great article here about that fact. In 1919, Smith was playing for, as I mentioned, the New York Giants, and they were playing an exhibition game against the New York Yankees. And Babe Ruth, or I think it was the Red Sox at the time, but Babe Ruth was playing against, no, it must have been the Yankees, I'm sorry. Babe Ruth and the Yankees were playing against the Giants, and it was an exhibition game. Smith is on the mound, and he throws a pitch, and Ruth hits a ball, according to the article, 587 feet, which is a number, if you follow baseball, 587 feet is basically impossible. But the article basically says that everybody went, oh my God, the minute Ruth hits you can see right here, my God, exclaimed one of the players, where is that ball going? So Smith's claim to fame, aside from losing 20 games, is that Babe Ruth hit the furthest ball in Tampa, Florida has ever seen. I love this because the article is written by John McGraw, and as you may know, John McGraw was the manager of the Giants. So McGraw is basically bashing his own player, Smith, and just being like, wow, this guy gave up a crushed home run. I have to write about this. But Smith, being a former major leaguer, shows up in Wilton and plays for the Farmers, and the teams that they were playing, as I mentioned, were semi-pro. A lot of these guys had been high school players. A lot of these guys were, plumbers during the week, and then they would play baseball on the weekends. So you can imagine a former major leaguer going up against, your average Joe on the weekends. He was pretty dang good. And he was the immediate dominant star of the 1926 New York-Connecticut League, which was a league formed in Fairfield County, Western Connecticut, and Eastern New York, that was started by Frank Riley. And Riley basically was like, this team's really good. We got to start playing further afield. Let's form this New York-Connecticut League. And Smith was basically immediately the MVP of the league. Smith was not the only former major leaguer that the Farmers had. Their other player was a guy by the name of Emmons Chick Bowens. Bowen had also joined the team well, he joined in 1925. He played a few games. He was an outfielder, and then joined the team full-time in 1926. Bowen had only played 3 games in the major leagues. He played what is known as a cup of coffee for major leaguers who basically play a handful of games and then never play again. But Bowen was a minor league superstar. He grew up in New Haven, went to Holy Cross in Massachusetts, my alma mater, so shout out to Chick Bowen. I had to throw him in there. But Chick Bowen went on to have a very distinguished college career. Played 3 games with the Giants, had 1 hit and a walk in 6 plate appearances, and then never played the majors again, but was really good in what was called the South Atlantic League. The South Atlantic League, or the Sowie League, actually still exists. It's a minor league, it's a AA league, and Bowen was a superstar there, but basically realized pretty quickly that he was never going to make it to the majors again and decided to retire. And he ended up being the baseball and football coach at New Haven High School. And during the summers, when he had time off, was recruited to join the Farmers, and he was incredibly good. So between Bowen and Smith, they basically had 2 former major leaguers playing against, like I said, guys who were carpenters and farmers on during the weekday, and then these major leaguers would show up and just crush everybody. Now, speaking of Babe Ruth, Smith and Bowen were not the only major leaguers who actually joined or came to Orem's Field. So did Babe Ruth. Ruth was friends with 2 former minor league players, 2 guys by the name of Francis Brogan and Godfrey Brogan, and the Brogans' parents lived here in Wilton. So when Francis and Godfrey, who never made it to the major leagues but had tried out with the New York Giants, they had met Babe Ruth while they were playing in these minor league teams, and when they joined the Farmers after their minor league careers ended, they invited Babe out to watch a game at Orem's Field, and the Babe, being the superstar that he was, didn't bring any baseball gear, but did bring a football, which he tossed around. This was 1936. So Ruth watched a game, hung out with the Brogans, hung out with the Brogans' parents, and threw a football around with some local kids. Actually, I don't remember the names off the top of my head, but several of these guys went on to be prominent Wiltonians, including a longtime Wilton dentist. And the not pictured in this is Harry Abbott, who would later go on to play for the Farmers and actually kept the football as a souvenir, which is great. But I love this photo because clearly these kids are very excited to be there, and Babe Ruth is, I think, probably a little tired from signing autographs. Now, the Farmers were really good at getting fans to the stadium, not only because they were incredibly good, but they joined a long tradition of baseball promotions. We know today if you go to a game, you might get a free t-shirt, a bobblehead, something like that. But baseball promotions go back way longer than that. They go back even to the 19th century, but they really took off with this guy, Bill Veeck. Bill Veeck was a major league owner. He did all sorts of crazy things to get players to the game, particularly when he owned the St. Louis Browns in the 1950s. The Browns were historically pretty terrible, so most of the entertaining things about the games was not the actual games itself, but the things that Veeck did. At one point, he had the fans manage the game, where they got yes or no signs, and a team employee would put up a sign asking for a managerial decision, and the fans would say yes or no, and then the team would actually do that. Veeck at one point actually hired this man, Eddie Goodell. Eddie Goodell suffered from dwarfism. He was 3'7", and Veeck decided he was going to have him pinch hit one game. Goodell goes out and he walked on 4 pitches. Small strike zone on Eddie Goodell. But Veeck might as well have been stealing from the Farmers because they had their own ways of getting people to the field, one of which was foul balls. And foul balls, you can see there's really only one backstop here, but there's no real fences. So when balls got fouled off, someone had to go chase them down. They didn't have a big bucket of balls like we do today even for Little League games. So the way that they got the balls back was that local kids could run after it and return to the umpire. And if they returned to the umpire, you got a nickel, which was the exact price of an ice cream or a candy bar at Orem's Diner. So kids would be encouraged to come to the game because they might be able to get a free ice cream out of it. Has anybody read the book, My Brother Sam is Dead? It was written by Christopher Collier. He was a Connecticut state historian for a while. Collier was a Wilton resident, grew up watching the Farmers, and actually in our archives he tells the story about all the kids chasing after foul balls to try to be the first one to get it so they could get an ice cream. Now that was fairly tame as far as what the Farmers did for promotions. They did something one year called donkey ball, which 3 guesses what that is. It's basically baseball on the backs of donkeys. And looks pretty much exactly like that. And apparently this was fairly common. They played it all throughout the 1930s. This was a common thing. The Farmers did it in 1940, and they did it actually to pay for one of their players had broke their arm during a game, and they needed to pay for his cast and medical expenses, so they played a charity game. Now my suspicion is that there were more injuries to be had playing on the backs of donkeys, but it was a creative thing, and they got players out. Apparently, actually, later that year, they went to play it again, and they were doing a recruiting drive for the local National Guard, and there were some Wilton residents who were part of the National Guard, and they were coming to look for these guys to recruit them, and couldn't find them anywhere. It's because all of them were at Orams Field playing donkey baseball, and basically the National Guard was like, all right, we're going to let the game finish, and then you guys got to come with us. The Farmers, I talked before about during World War II, the All-American Girls Baseball League. Now, that was not the first attempt at getting high-level women's baseball. There was a team that formed in 1910 called the New York Bloomer Girls. They played between 1910 and 1935. They were, as I mentioned, all-women's team. And they were basically an all-star team of women throughout the New York, Connecticut, New Jersey area. And they were very good, incredibly good. They would challenge men's teams all across the East Coast. They were famous for playing not only against women's teams, but men's teams. They actually played against the Negro League teams as well, which was quite a unusual thing to see, having white women playing against an African-American team. But in 1935, they actually came to Orams Field and they played a game. Wilton beat them in extra innings, 9-8. Apparently it was a very close game. And you can see it mentioned here, the Norwalk Hour. And actually, the game ball from the game still exists. This was sent to us by a researcher who was looking into it. I have to ask her where she sourced this from. But you can see down here, it's hard to make out, but it says at Orams Field, September 15th, 1935. Margaret Noble was the manager of the New York Bloomer Girls, and you can see that the Bloomer Girls are put there, and the ball's covered in the team's signature. So a record of this game still exists, but the Farmers apparently were prominent enough that the Bloomer Girls came out to play, and they came to play. Now, baseball wasn't the only thing that happened at Orams Field. Field was sort of a community center at the time. Frequently what they would do was have dances after games. We can see an advertisement here in the Norwalk Evening Sentinel in 1921. It says, a large attendance marked the regular Friday night open-air dance given by the Wilton Baseball Club. So basically, Friday night before the weekend games, they'd have a big dance to get everybody out to say, hey, there's a game tomorrow. Apparently the music was excellent. And whoever built the floor, it says the floor was in dandy shape, being built as if it were set in concrete. So Charlie Oram was doing something right when he put the dance floor together. But you can imagine if the Yankees basically were like, we're going to have a rave Friday night before the game on Saturday. Clever way to get people out. Orams Field was quite a bit of a multi-use space. Every year they did a firefighters sort of fundraiser where the firefighters would come out and take all the ladders out and show all the life-saving equipment that they had. But there were dances, there were picnics, all sorts of things. Orams Field was sort of the outdoor space that people would come to, and Charlie Oram was happy to have them there. Now, unfortunately, World War II was the end of the Farmers. With the players getting actually drafted, Oram actually sold the dairy in 1939. The dairy did exist, but Oram was no longer the owner of it. So the field was still there, and the Farmers kept playing. But unfortunately, by 1942, during the war, they started rationing gasoline, so it was harder for players to actually get to the games. The Farmers in the 20s were going as far as Poughkeepsie, New York to play. So you can imagine driving at that time, it was hard. Price restrictions with rationing made it hard to get equipment, all sorts of things. And then finally, a bunch of the players got drafted and joined the military, so they weren't able to play anymore. So the team folded in 1941. There was a Ridgefield team that played at Orms Field in 1942, but after that season, the league sort of folded, and that ended just over 2 decades of the Farmers being just incredibly dominant. They were, the team to beat in the area. Now, that doesn't mean that the baseball ended in Wilton with World War II. There was a pause, but starting in 1946, the Cannondale Athletic Club formed. And it was how baseball came back to Wilton. So you can see the team here. This was actually them, not 1946, probably about 1948. You can see their very fancy Script C uniforms. But they basically picked up the mantle where the Farmers left off and decided that they were going to be the dominant team in Wilton. And they started playing all throughout the Fairfield County area. They joined what was called the Intertown League. It wasn't quite as big as the New York-Connecticut League was. They weren't traveling to Poughkeepsie, but they were playing against Danbury and Ridgefield and Norwalk and Bridgeport and a lot of local towns. By this point, Orms Field had went away, unfortunately. They were playing their home games at what was called Harbs Field. If you've ever been over to Wilton High School where the tennis courts are, that's approximately where Harbs Field was. So not too far from the football field and some of the other fields that are down there. They were also no longer semi-pro anymore. At this point, it was hard to sell as many tickets, and the league wasn't quite as big. So the players were, for the most part, amateur and pretty much all from Wilton. And before, when Riley was putting together a team, he was grabbing guys who were from all over Connecticut, all over New York. Now it was pretty much all Wilton players, a few Norwalk ones as well. But they were also very, very good. They joined what was called, in 1952, they joined what was called the Danbury League, which was a basically Western Connecticut league. You can see by that point, they had claimed the named Farmers, so the name was back. The Wilton Farmers name certainly meant a lot to people in the community at that point. So they decided that they were going to sort of take the baton from the Farmers, even though they weren't playing on an actual farm anymore. But they were incredibly good also as well. One of the reasons for that was because they recruited the best Wilton players, one of which was a guy by the name of Link Scribner. The Scribners have deep Wilton roots. They go back to the 1700s in Wilton. But the MVP of the Danbury League was Scribner. He was a pitcher and repeatedly won 80% of the games that he pitched in. He was also a pretty good hitter too. Any pitcher who's hitting 321 is a guy you want on your team. But they were still listed as the Wilton Athletic Club, and the Farmers was sort of their unofficial name. But they were, throughout the late 1940s and basically throughout the 1950s and into the 60s, they were the best team in a lot of these sort of local, the leagues kept changing. It was the Intertown League, then it was the Danbury League, then it was the Eastern League, then it was back to the Intertown League. It changed a bunch of times. You can see here, even up into the 1965, they were playing in what was called the Norwalk City League. They won the championship this year. Their record, I think, was only about like 10-4 or something like that. Every year they were only playing about 15, 20 games. The Wilton Farmers, back in their heyday, were playing 20, 30, 40 games a season because they wanted to make as much money as possible. So by the 1960s, it was a little more slightly more casual playing in the Norwalk City League, but they were, again, still very good. Unfortunately, by the 1970s, the team started to fade away. And this was for a couple different reasons. I talked before about sort of Wilton matching the Farmers matching history as it developed. And the town at this point was becoming much more of a suburb. By the 70s, the population was over 10,000. And you could get your baseball from TV, the radio. You didn't have to go to a local town game. They were only drawing a few dozen people by the 1970s. And apparently it was hard to get even the players to show up in the 1970s. This article here was in 1974 complaining that the Farmers were managed by just some local player coaches, and they would show up to games and half the roster wouldn't be there because they had better things to do on the weekends. So unfortunately, one of his proposals was to have a dinner where they award players at the end for good play. which was something that they used to do back in the 50s. We have some great photos of Link Scribner at a banquet for the Norwalk City League getting his MVP award. But apparently by the 1970s, people had, lives got busier, people had things to do on the weekend, and the Farmers were no longer the hottest ticket in town, and people were going to their Little League games, their Babe Ruth games instead. But it was sort of the end of unfortunate end of an era for a team that really had defined sort of Wilton entertainment for about 50 years. And I have a soft spot for the Farmers. They did, so many crazy things with Orams Field. They used to have a band come and play, a full marching band would come and play every Memorial Day and every July 4th. This is July 4th, 1921. They had their Wilton Ball Grounds scoreboard. So it was, a really well-established thing. People loved the Farmers. And I think just sort of the last bastion of Wilton being a really, really small town. I mean, we like to say Wilton's a small town, but 1,300 people is slightly different than today. And you get a sense of real community pride. People would come out to see the Farmers because it was their way of showing off Wilton and really being, the thing that they took pride in. Our baseball team's better than yours, and our field's cooler than yours, and we have an ice cream stand, and we're better than you. So that's the story of the Farmers. I love them very, very much. They have a soft spot in my heart. Apparently, Babe Ruth wasn't the only one who was drawn out here. I found a secondhand account that Lefty Grove, the Hall of Fame pitcher, actually came out and pitched a game after his career was over at Orams Field. I haven't been able to find that in the newspaper records. When you look up baseball articles from the 1920s in the local paper, I wouldn't say they're the most quality journalism that you can find in the baseball reporting, and they don't even report on all the games. I'd love to put together a sort of a stats database of all the Wilton Farmers, but tracking down box scores from 1922 was not always the easiest thing in the world. But yeah, that's the Wilton Farmers. A great thing. I would love to see come back if anybody knows any former major leaguers who got some time to kill. We can get a field somewhere, but. I'd love to answer any and all questions you have about the Farmers. Thank you all for coming. Well, yes?
Do you have any shirts or other things?
No, unfortunately we don't. I would love to. The only thing we have is the photo of Babe Ruth that we have I won't say original, it was a sort of a later developed one from the sort of original photograph. But yeah, as far as I know, there's no Wilton Farmers shirts or jerseys or equipment that exists. We do have in our collection, so talking about Orem being a promoter, Orem's dairy farm was basically the milk supply. Back when milkmen would go door to door and they would deliver milk, Orem would put Wilton baseball grounds on his dairy bottles as sort of an advertisement for the game. We have, I think there's one maybe upstairs in the exhibit upstairs, but we've exhibited before. But yeah, what we have from the Wilton Farmers is the milk bottles that that Charlie Orem would use to promote the game. We do have a catcher's chest protector from the 1950s, which may connect to what would have been the Farmers. It was found in the parsonage in the walls of the Wilton Congregational Church parsonage. So it wasn't connected to a specific Wilton Farmers player, but I'd like to think that the timing, the age of it and the timing of it was being used by somebody who was playing for the Farmers in the 50s. And then we do have a get well soon card actually from the guy who fractured his ankle, from what I remember. He's in the hospital, and everyone writes him a card, and they're basically like, get well soon, and the game takes place afterwards. So no official game used stuff. I wish it was out there. If anybody knows anybody, I'd love to have it. But we have some adjacent memorabilia. Other questions? Last time yes, question.
My mother always told me about my grandfather played, but I think he was a carpenter, and I think it would not have been a pinch hit thing.
Okay.
Whatever. But is there any more extensive list of, because there's probably lots of people around that played on there.
Yeah, what I really need to do is go through all the newspaper records and compile a list of people. Because every time, I've given, not this talk, but I've talked about the Farmers in the past, and I feel like every time I do, someone shows up who says, oh, my grandfather, my father played for the Farmers. So I sort of need to put the official roster together. Every time we talk about the Farmers, I get somebody who emails me a photo of their grandfather in a Farmers uniform, which I always love. There was actually the first, we did an exhibit in 2017 on the Farmers, and I did sort of an opening. And we had two guys who were former Farmers players show up, and then we had a guy who was on the Norwalk rival team show up and talk about playing against the Farmers. And apparently the Wilton-Norwalk rivalry back in the day was heated. I found a newspaper article of, at one point, the Wilton coach was yelling at the Norwalk pitcher. They're unnamed, unfortunately, in the article, maybe to protect everyone's identity. But apparently, after the scuffle sort of happened, the Norwalk pitcher delivered the next pitch, not towards the batter, but at the Wilton coach and actually hit him. And then benches cleared and proceeded to be a fight after that. So it was funny because there was the guy who had played for the Norwalk team, his name was Lou, and I forget his last name, but he was like, you could kind of tell he still held a grudge. Like he was a little annoyed. He remembered one game where, somebody slid into home plate with their cleats up and spiked somebody, benches cleared, and then the next guy got hit and benches cleared. And he had his version of the story. The Wilton guys who were there had their version of the story. But so again, we don't necessarily have the objects, but these stories that we have in the newspaper and from people who got interviewed years ago about playing for the Farmers is the really interesting stuff, because they love to, the former players, their eyes light up when they get to talk about playing for the Farmers. Yes?
I was wondering if you know how much they charge for admission, and I'm just wondering between splitting it with Orem and then all the players, like how much they actually could make.
That I haven't been able to find, unfortunately, because there's no, I haven't been able to find a flyer that they handed out that was admissions. It's all newspaper articles basically saying the game's going to happen. Given the time period, I can't imagine, I think it was 25 cents or something like that. I thought I saw a record somewhere of the Orms Field had their grandstand. So this was added in the mid-1920s. And apparently it was an extra it was 25 cents to go to the game and then 30 cents to sit in the grandstand. Something like that, approximately. It sort of depends on the year. I know Columbia George Smith, apparently, after about 2 years with the Farmers, decided to play for Poughkeepsie because it was a bigger stadium and he could make more money with more admissions. So he skipped town. But yeah, I don't know exactly how much the players were making. I think it also depended on the player. Depending on how good you are, you could command, just like today, you could command a little bit more money. It must have been a good enough amount because Orem actually had two other guys who were sort of investors. Johnny Knapp and Charlie Myers were sort of the other team, chairman and treasurer. So apparently they were making enough money that they could split it 15, 16 ways. And everybody went home at least relatively happy. So yeah, apparently it must have been a good amount. I imagine they were playing quite a bit to make that much, though. Yeah?
Have you connected with Orem at all to further explore this? I know that there's still a men's league today that has an Orem Steiner team. Is there any indirect connection? Yeah,
so we have a good relationship with Orems. They sponsored the exhibit that we did in 2017, so they know a little bit of the history. It has since moved out of the Orems family. So, I know that they're aware of the history. I don't know if they have, I'd love to see if they have any, memorabilia left over. But yeah, we connect with Orems every so often. I think on their website, they actually have, speaking of a roster of players, they have the starting lineup of the team from the July 4th, 1921 game or something like that on their website. So yeah, but I'd love to do more. Maybe they'd be willing to sponsor an old time baseball game or something like that.
Yeah. One of the slides showed what I think was the barn.
Oh, yes. Where was it?
There you go.
Yeah.
Add it over to the left, right?
Yeah, so that would have been, if I have my, no.
It was next, across from the gas station, essentially.
Yeah, so there was an 1860s barn on the property. Actually, the Historical Society owns when it was deconstructed back in 2018, we received the barn, so we're hoping to actually reconstruct that at some point. I don't know if it's exactly that barn, but I know the barn that we have would have been way out in sort of the right field area based on how the field was located. So It may be sort of like just off the screen over there. But yeah, there were farm buildings out in sort of right center that they would have had to dodge.
And those two other buildings, you know?
Um,
It's a little hard to
I don't from this photo.
different, isn't it?
Yeah, it does look a little bit different because this Route 7 basically is running this way. But I'm not sure if those buildings still stand, unfortunately. But yeah, and a grainy photo, I'm not sure. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys. Thank you. I hope this inspires you to form your own semi-pro team on a farm field. All right. Well, take care. Have a good night, folks.
Thank you.